Hello students. Today I am going to discuss Chapter 3, History, the Moderates. In the years following 1885, the Indian National Congress grew from mere association or a party into a movement which is known as the National Movement. And already we have seen in our previous chapter that how the National Congress during its formative phase, they have attempted to have its demands through constitutional methods. But did the Congress achieve much during the first 20 years of existence? Did the British fulfill any of their demands? Were all the members of the Congress were satisfied with the methods adopted by their leaders? Let us find out in this chapter. With the formation of Indian National Congress in 1885, India found a forum for expression of its grievances. The Indian national movement began under the leadership of the Congress, and the movement can be studied under three phases. The first phase from the moderates from 1885-1905, radical phase 1905 to 1918, and the Gandhian era that starts from 1918 till 1947. So we are now going to discuss about the moderate phase in this chapter. The moderate phase, that is from 1885 to 1905. The early phase of the freedom struggle or the Indian national movement was very limited in its popular base. It was in fact confined only to educated classes, and through the Indian National Congress was supposed to be an all India organization. It still had been a major task in hand to educate the people politically and to work by the political means for the general improvement in their economic and political conditions. The key characteristics of the early nationalist. Firstly, they had an unlimited faith in the British sense of justice. Secondly, they asked for constitutional reform but within the framework of the British rule in India. And thirdly, their methods were quite moderate. That is, they carried their agitation through petitions and resolutions. The objectives and the demands of the early nationalist. The constitutional reforms. The early nationalists, they had asked for abolition of Indian Council. Now, what was Indian Council? After 1857, the British Parliament, they had taken over the direct control of the government of India. A minister of British cabinet, known as the Secretary of State for India, was given charge of all Indian affairs. A Council of India or Indian Council was formed to advise the Secretary of the State. Its members were Englishmen who served in India early. But it did not prove to be effective. So the moderates felt that Indian Council should be abolished. Secondly, the Congress at its first session, they had asked for expansion of legislative councils. Thirdly, the Congress insisted on colonial form of government, that is, the system of administration that is found in the dominance of Canada and Australia. Administrative reforms. The Congress urged upon the government to give effect to the following reforms. Firstly, wider employment of Indians in higher services. Holding examinations both in England and in India for the recruitment of Indian civil service. Representation of Indians in Executive Council of the Viceroy. Fourthly, complete separation of executive and the judicial functions. And finally, an increase in the power of the local or municipal bodies. Economic reforms. The congressmen, they demanded reduction in land revenue and protection of the peasants against the unjust demands of the zamindars, giving cheap loans to the peasants, total abolition of salt tax and duty on sugar, to develop modern industries, and to reduce the expenditure on the army and the money thus saved to be spent on social service such as health and education. safeguarding the civil liberties. The moderates, they strongly oppose the restrictions imposed by the British government on freedom of speech, press, and association. They demanded scrapping of the Preventive Detention Act. Now, why these early congressmen were called moderates? Most of the early congressmen, they believed in constitutional method. They were humble and modest in their criticism of the British government, and therefore they are known as moderates. Some of the important moderate leaders like Firoz Shah Mehta, Dadabhai Nauroji, Surendranath Banerjee, and Gopal Krishna Gokhale. The belief, the moderate leaders, they had faith in the British sense of justice. They believed that British were unable of the ground realities in India, and they had a firm belief that gradually the British would concede to their demands. The Congress in those days were a band of loyalists and who were proud of the British connections. To England, they looked for inspiration and guidance. Even when they criticized the government, they maintained a certain dignity and moderation. Their methods of struggle. The early nationalists, they did not believe in agitation. They carried their agitation through, firstly, petitions, second, resolutions, third, meetings, fourth, distribution of leaflets and pamphlets, fifth, preparing memorandum or a written report for submission to the committees of the British government. Sixth, sending delegations of leading Indians to England to have talks with the British authorities. Official attitude of the British government. In the beginning, the attitude of the British government towards the Congress was friendly and sympathetic. Its first session was attended by certain distinguished British officials. The second session of 1886 was held at Calcutta, and most of the delegates were received by the Viceroy, Lord Dufferin, as distinguished visitors to the capital. The third session of the Congress, held at Madras in 1887, was attended by about 600 delegates who were given a colourful reception by the Governor of Madras. But this friendly attitude of the government did not last long, as the Congress began demanding more and more rights for the Indians, which the government was not prepared to grant. The growing strength and the popularity of the national movement made it suspect in the eye of the foreign rulers, and they began to criticize it. In 1887, Lord Dufferin attacked the Congress in a public speech and ridiculed it as representing only a microscopic minority of the people. He called the demands of the Congress as eminently unconstitutional and Congress as a seditious body. Henceforth, the British government began to act in opposition of the Congress and create obstacles in its progress. Failures and achievements of early nationalists. The early nationalist has been criticized, first of all, of their methods of prayers and petitions. Secondly, in those early days, the Congress lacked the mass appeal. It represented the English educated, well-to-do, and the middle classes. Thirdly, the early nationalists, they believed that sooner or later the British would agree to establish representative institutions in India. They could not see that the British and Indian interest, they clashed with each other. Britain was using India's resources in order to increase its own wealth. Achievements. Firstly, they infused national consciousness among the various sections of public life. Secondly, they had done a lot to popularize the ideas of democracy, civil liberty, and representative institutions. Thirdly, these early leaders, they explained that how the British was exploiting India. Fourthly, early nationalists like Ranade and Gokhale were very passionate supporters of social reform in India. They had raised their voice against social evils like child marriage and imposed widowhood. Finally, they have been trying to put pressure on the government to reform the legislative councils. In brief, this early period was thus the seed time of Indian nationalism. Prominent leaders in the early days of Indian nationalism. Dadabhai Naoroji, he was the pioneer of Indian statesmen. He came to be known as the Grand Old Man of India. He was born on 4th September 1825 in Parsi family of Mumbai. In 1854, he was appointed as a professor of mathematics in the Elphinstone College in Mumbai. His contribution to the freedom struggle. Dadabhai's love for the nation and his contribution to the nationalistic movement thus are as follows. He was India's unofficial ambassador in England. In 1866, Dadabhai Naoroji founded East India Association in England. The purpose of this organization is to inform the British of the true state of affairs in India. This was probably his first political move in the ongoing struggle for freedom. Naoroji returned to India in 1874 and he was appointed as the Diwan of Baroda state. He was also the member of Legislative Council of Mumbai from 1885 to 1888. He played an active role in the foundation of Indian National Congress. He was elected the President of the Congress in 1886. He came back to England in 1886 and got elected to the British Parliament in 1892. He made many speeches both in England and in India on the Irish Home Rule and the need for political reforms and justice in India. Dadabhai Naoroji, he spearheaded the beginning of freedom struggle, and that is why the historians tend to call him the founding father of Indian nationalism. Thrice he had presided over the Congress in 1886, 1893 and 1906. His presidency of the Congress in 1906 was very memorable. The partition of Bengal in 1905 had very sadly disillusioned the early nationalists. Their power and their prestige was on decline. Therefore, they persuaded Dadabhai Naoroji to preside over the Kolkata session of the Congress in 1906. Dadabhai's name and fame made it very difficult for the assertives to oppose, although they liked to have Tilak to hold that office. Dadabhai Naoroji historic address to the Kolkata session of the Congress in 1906. Dadabhai Naoroji's historic address was read out by Mr. Gokhale due to Dadabhai's ill health, and it laid stress on attainment of Swaraj. Thus, the Congress session of 1906 passed resolutions on Swaraj, Swadeshi, boycott, and national education. His emancipation of the nature of British imperialism and the cause of poverty, Dadabhai Naoroji's famous drain theory, and his views on Indian economy. Dadabhai edited Rasht Goftar, Speaker of Truth. He also started a magazine, Dharma Marg Darshak. Dadabhai's views on Indian economy and exploitation of India could be gathered from his classic work, Poverty and Un-British Rule in India. Through this famous drain theory, he explained that how India's wealth was being taken away to England in the various forms. Firstly, salaries payable to the members of Indian Council. Secondly, the dispatch of savings to England by the British personnel posted in India. Thirdly, pensions to the British officers. Fourthly, payments to the War Office for maintenance of British troops in India. Fifth, profits of the British trading agencies. Dadabhai passed away in 1917 He was a great life nobly lived, spanning more than 9 decades as a professor, legislator, thinker, and a statesman. His life was a glorious age of devotion to duty. He was indeed a pathfinder of Indian nationalism. Surendranath Banerjee was another prominent moderate leader of the early years of the national movement. He was born in Calcutta in 1848. He graduated from Calcutta University in 1868 and subsequently proceeded to England to compete for Indian civil service. He was able to successfully clear the competitive examination, but the British government raised objection over his exact age and declared him disqualified. Protesting against the racial discrimination, Surendranath appealed against the decision and he won. He reappeared for civil service examination in 1871 and was appointed as the assistant magistrate in Sylhet. However, some charges were being framed against him and he was dismissed from his service in 1873. After his dismissal from Indian civil service, Surendranath became the professor of English in Metropolitan Institution. Later on, he joined the Free Church College at Kolkata. In 1882, he started a school which later on grew into a college, Lord Ripon College. Surendranath Banerjee's fight against injustice and repression. Surendranath he took to public life in 1876, the year he founded the Indian Association. The object of this association was to agitate for introduction of political reforms in India. In 1877, the age limit for civil service examination was reduced from 21 to 19. Surendranath Banerjee made a tour of India protesting against the reduction of maximum age limit. He fearlessly criticized measures such as Arms Act and Vernacular Press Act. Elective offices were just a means to serve people. Surendranath was elected to Kolkata Corporation in 1876 and there for more than 2 decades. He was elected to the Bengal Legislative Council in 1894, 1896 and 1900. Surendranath transformed his civic and political duties into means to serve people. Surendranath played a foremost role in the formative phase of the Indian National Congress and became its president twice, in 1895 and 1902. A senior moderate, he used the platform of the Congress to protest against the partition of Bengal in 1905. He was one of the foremost leaders of the Swadeshi movement in Bengal. His role as a journalist. For several years, Surendranath edited The Bengali, which had been founded by W.C. Banerjee. This paper very much criticized the Ilbert Bill and the Vernacular Press Act. A firm believer in India's right to self-government, he was a firm believer in India's right to self-government, and his best-known book is A Nation in Making. Thus, Surendranath Banerjee he disapproved violent methods, but he urged the Indians to boycott foreign goods. He supported Swadeshi movement. He said, "Take the Swadeshi vow, and you will have broad and deep the foundations of your industrial and political emancipation." Gopal Krishna Gokhale is one of the leading personalities of the early years of freedom struggle. He graduated from Elphinstone College, Bombay in 1884. He had a great understanding of history, which made him develop respect for modern ideas of liberty, democracy, and the parliamentary system. His educational training under Mahadev Govind Ranade imparted a great influence on his political career. Ranade trained him in all spheres of public life. His faith in constitutional means. Gokhale believed in constitutional agitation, that is, in petitions, appeals to justice, and passive resistance. But at the same time, he supported Swadeshi movement. He presided over the Benares session of Indian National Congress in 1905. He made a plea for the reform of legislative councils and separation of judiciary from the executive. He established Servants of India Society in 1905. The aim of this society is to train men to devote their lives to the cause of the country. Its members were required to create among the people a deep and a passionate love for the motherland. The society worked for the educated woman and also for the upliftment of the depressed classes. In 1902, Gokhale had become the member of the Imperial or Central Legislative Council. In his speeches, he had pleaded for reduction in salt duty, abolition of excise duty on cotton goods. In 1910 and 1912, he moved resolutions in the Central Legislative Council for the relief of the Indian bonded labor in Natal. In one of his budget speeches, he had pleaded for free primary education for all children, and Gokhale would like Indians to be given also a large share in Indian civil service. His economic ideas. Gokhale was deeply pained to see the misery of the peasantry. So he pleaded for reduction of land revenue, and Gokhale was in favor of state protection to the infant Indian industries. He was called for the employment of the members of educated middle class. In 1912, Gokhale visited South Africa and met Gandhiji, who was involved in a campaign to defend the rights of the Indians. Gokhale had a huge influence on Mahatma. In fact, Gandhi in his autobiography had called Gokhale his mentor and guide. His involvement in such a wide range of public and legislative bodies and his commitment to the advancement of education had, however, worn him out, and he died in Pune on 15th February 1915.